I'm Daniel, 38 male. I live in a modest three-bedroom house in the suburbs, the same one my wife and I bought 10 years ago, dreaming of filling it with the laughter of children we were never able to have. For the last 15 years, I've been the operations manager at Vanguard Logistics, the family company my grandfather built from a single truck into a regional powerhouse. This business wasn't just my job. It was my inheritance, my identity, and the source of a quiet, gnawing pressure that had defined my entire adult life. Little did I know, the family I had dedicated my life to was about to cast me out, accusing me of driving our shared legacy into the ground, all while the real traitor sat across the table smiling. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The air in the boardroom was thick with an unnatural silence, the kind that precedes a storm. It was a stark contrast to the usual cacophony of ringing phones and hurried conversations that filled the halls of Vanguard Logistics. I sat at the long mahogany table, the polished surface reflecting my strained, weary face. Opposite me sat my younger brother, Mark, his expression a carefully constructed mask of concern. At the head of the table, our mother, Alina, presided with the stoic authority of a retired queen, her gaze sharp and unforgiving. The past few months had been a slow, agonizing bleed. Our profit margins, once a source of family pride, had thinned to a razor's edge. Key clients were pulling back, citing inexplicable delays and billing discrepancies that fell squarely under my purview as operations manager. Every issue, every complaint, and every lost contract was a stone cast in my direction. Daniel, my mother began, her voice cutting through the tension like a shard of glass. We've reviewed the quarterly reports. Again, the numbers are catastrophic. She slid a bound document across the table. It stopped inches from my hands, an indictment bound in cheap plastic. I didn't need to open it. I had spent sleepless nights staring at those figures, the red ink a testament to my perceived failures. Mark, in his role as head of sales, was supposed to be bringing in the business, while I was responsible for making sure the logistical cogs turned smoothly. Lately, it felt like every cog was grinding to a halt, no matter how much effort I poured into fixing them. "I know, Mom," I said, my voice hoarse. "I've been working on it. There are inefficiencies in the supply chain that I'm trying to iron out. The fuel cost increase has hit us harder than anticipated," and Mark cut me off, a practiced sigh of frustration in his voice. "Daniel, we've been hearing the same excuses for 6 months," he said, shaking his head with a sorrowful air that was almost believable. "It's not just fuel costs, it's mismanagement. We lost the Sterling account last week because of a fulfillment error. That was our biggest client. They said they couldn't trust our logistics anymore." He looked at our mother, his eyes wide with feigned earnestness. "I spend months, sometimes years, building relationships with these clients, and they vanish overnight because operations can't keep up. It's heartbreaking." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The Sterling account had been a devastating blow. The error was a simple one on paper, a misrouted shipment that arrived 2 weeks late, but the consequences were immense. I had personally overseen the internal review, but the data was a mess. The tracking logs had been corrupted, and the warehouse manager responsible had quit unexpectedly the day after the incident, leaving behind more questions than answers. I couldn't prove it, but something felt wrong, manipulated. "It wasn't that simple, Mark," I countered, my hands clenched into fists under the table. "The system logs for that shipment were tampered with. I was investigating it." "Investigating?" Mark scoffed, the corner of his mouth twisting into a smirk. "Or looking for someone else to blame? Daniel, this is a pattern. You've become overwhelmed. The company has grown, and maybe the role has grown beyond you." His words were a direct hit, striking at the core of my deepest insecurities. I had always felt like I was living in the shadow of our father, a brilliant and ruthless businessman who had passed away 5 years ago, leaving the company in our hands. He had been the visionary, I was the pragmatist, the one who kept the wheels turning. Mark, on the other hand, had inherited our father's charm and charisma, but none of his substance. He was a salesman, all flash and promises, and I often felt he saw the company as his personal piggy bank. Our mother, who had always been more swayed by Mark's smooth words than my quiet diligence, nodded in agreement. "Mark is right, Daniel, W. E can't afford to keep bleeding like this. Vanguard is your father's legacy. It's our legacy. We have to protect it." Her voice was cold, devoid of the maternal warmth I craved. In her eyes, I saw not a son, but a failing component of a machine she was desperate to fix. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The pieces were clicking into place. The last few months of subtle digs, closed-door meetings between Mark and my mother, and the increasing isolation I felt within my own company, all leading to this moment. "We've had an offer," Mark said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A private equity firm is interested in acquiring a majority stake. They see potential, but they want to clean house. They want a new operations head, someone with a fresh perspective. You're selling the company? I asked, stunned. This was the first I was hearing of it. We're saving it, my mother corrected sharply. And the board has agreed. As part of the restructuring, your position is being made redundant. We're offering you a severance package, of course. A modest one, given the circumstances. The word redundant echoed in my ears. I wasn't just being fired, I was being erased from my own family's history. I looked at Mark at the flicker of triumph in his eyes that he couldn't quite conceal, and I knew this was a coup and I was the deposed king. You planned this, I said, my voice barely a whisper. You've been setting me up. Mark recoiled dramatically, placing a hand over his heart. Daniel, that's a horrible thing to say. I love you, you're my brother. This is the hardest decision we've ever had to make, but the business has to come first. His performance was flawless, but I could see the cracks in the facade. The way he avoided my gaze, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his water glass, he was lying. My mother, however, was completely convinced. She saw Mark as the savior and me as the dead weight he was reluctantly cutting loose. The vote was a formality. It was unanimous. I was out. They gave me until the end of the day to clear out my desk, a final, humiliating gesture. As I walked back to my office, the sympathetic and pitying looks from my colleagues were like daggers in my back. These were people I had worked with for over a decade, people I had mentored and supported. Now they saw me as a failure, the man who had almost run Vanguard Logistics into the ground. My office, once a place of pride, now felt like a tomb. I packed my belongings into a cardboard box, each item a painful reminder of a life that was being ripped away from me. Family photos, industry awards, a framed blueprint of our first automated warehouse, a project I had spearheaded. It all felt like a cruel joke. As I emptied the bottom drawer of my desk, my fingers brushed against a set of old, leather-bound books. They were my father's old ledgers, the ones he kept by hand before everything was digitized. He was a meticulous record keeper, a man who believed that numbers told a story. He had given them to me when I first started, telling me, "Know where you came from, son. It'll help you see where you're going." I had kept them for sentimental reasons, a tangible link to the man I had so desperately tried to emulate. On a whim, I tossed them into the box. I didn't know why, but in that moment of utter despair, they felt like the only piece of my father's true legacy I had left. The severance check they had given me was insultingly small, barely enough to cover a few months' mortgage. As I walked out of the building for the last time, the weight of my family's betrayal settled upon me, heavy and cold. They had not only taken my job, they had taken my name, my history, and my future. They had made me the scapegoat for a fire that, I was beginning to realize, someone else had started. The front door of my house clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. My wife Sarah had left me 6 months prior, a casualty of the long hours and mounting stress that the failing business had inflicted upon our marriage. "You're married to that company, not to me," she had said, her words a prophecy I hadn't understood at the time. Now the house was just a hollow shell, a monument to a life I had failed to build. I dropped the cardboard box of my former life onto the dining room table, the thud punctuating the oppressive silence. I felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if I were a ghost in my own home. My reflection in the darkened window showed a stranger, a man hollowed out by defeat, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of despair. I'd wake up late, the lack of purpose a heavy blanket I couldn't cast off. I'd wander through the house, the silence amplifying the recriminations swirling in my head. Redundant, mismanagement. The role has grown beyond you, Mark's words, my mother's cold agreement. And they played on a loop, each repetition chipping away at my self-worth. I tried to apply for other jobs, scrolling through listings for operations managers and logistics coordinators, but my heart wasn't in it. How could I sell myself to another company when I was convinced of my own incompetence? My family, the people who were supposed to be my staunchest allies, had declared me a failure. Their verdict felt absolute, an undeniable truth I had no power to contest. My attempts to reach out were met with a wall of silence. I called my mother a dozen times, leaving voicemails that started with anger, softened to pleading, and ended in resigned silence. She never called back. I sent Mark a single curt text, "We need to talk." His reply came hours later, "I'm sorry, Daniel, it's for the best. We all need to move on." Move on? It was so easy for him to say. He was still the golden boy, the charismatic head of sales who was now being hailed as the company's savior. I saw the press release online a week later. It announced the new partnership with the private equity firm and lauded Mark's strategic vision in navigating the company through a challenging transitional period. There was no mention of my 15 years of service. I had been written out of the story completely. The financial pressure began to mount. The severance package, which had seemed meager to begin with, dwindled at an alarming rate. The mortgage, the bills, the cost of living, it was a relentless tide threatening to pull me under. I started selling things. First, it was the expensive watch my father had given me for my 30th birthday. Then the golf clubs I rarely used. Each sale was a small surrender, another piece of my old life bartered away for a few more weeks of survival. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my house. Friends would call, their voices laced with a mixture of concern and awkwardness, but I'd let the calls go to voicemail. I was too ashamed to talk to them to admit the full extent of my humiliation. I was Daniel, the man who had been kicked out of his own family business. The scapegoat. One rainy afternoon, as I was listlessly cleaning out the garage, I stumbled upon the box from my old office. It was a painful reminder, and my first instinct was to throw it out to burn the last vestiges of my failed career. But something stopped me. I brought the box inside and began to sort through its contents, each item a small ghost of the past. Tucked at the bottom were my father's old ledgers. I ran my hand over the worn leather, the familiar scent of old paper and ink a strange comfort. My father was a man of logic and order. He believed that everything from a complex supply chain to a family dispute could be understood if you just looked at the numbers. He taught me to read a balance sheet like a story, to find the narrative hidden within the columns of figures. With nothing else to do, I opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with his neat, precise handwriting, a stark contrast to the chaos of my own life. I started at the beginning, tracing the company's history from its humble origins. I saw the early struggles, the first big contracts, the expansions, the risks that paid off and the ones that didn't. It was all there, a testament to his hard work and dedication. As I moved to the later volumes, from the years just before his death, a strange sense of unease began to creep over me. I was looking at the financial records from 5 years ago, the period when Mark had just been promoted to head of sales and I was solidifying my role in operations. The numbers were healthy, the company was growing, but there was something off. I noticed a series of small, recurring expenses coded to client entertainment under the sales department. They weren't huge amounts, just a few $1,000s here and there, but they were consistent, almost weekly. My father was notoriously frugal. He believed in building relationships through reliability and service, not expensive dinners and lavish gifts. He would have never approved of such expenditures. I cross-referenced the dates of these expenses with the digital records I still had access to on my personal laptop, old quarterly reports I had saved for reference. The digital versions were different. The client entertainment expenses were gone, reclassified under broader, more ambiguous categories like marketing and outreach or operational supplies. The amounts were the same, but their tracks had been covered. My heart began to beat faster. It was a small thing, a minor discrepancy, but it was a thread. And I felt a desperate primal urge to pull on it. For weeks, I had been drowning in the narrative my family had created for me, the story of my incompetence. But here in my father's meticulous handwriting was the first hint of a different story, a story that had been deliberately hidden. The despair that had held me captive for weeks began to recede, replaced. New, unfamiliar feeling, a cold, sharp-edged resolve. I didn't know what I would find, but for the first time since I had walked out of that boardroom, I had a purpose. I was no longer in exile, waiting for my fate to be decided by others. I was an investigator, and my father's ledgers were my map. I would follow the trail, no matter where it led. I would uncover the truth, not just for my own vindication, but for the sake of the legacy they had accused me of destroying. The ledgers became my obsession. I spread them across the dining room table, creating a timeline that spanned the last decade of Vanguard logistics. My days, once empty and aimless, were now filled with a singular, consuming purpose. I cross-referenced every entry in my father's handwriting with the digitized financial statements I had on my old hard drives. The work was painstaking, a slow and methodical process of sifting through years of data, but with each passing day, the pattern became clearer. The discrepancies always originated in the sales department, and they always began around the time Mark was given control of its budget, nearly 5 years ago. The client entertainment expenses were just the beginning. I found inflated invoices from shell companies, consulting fees paid to firms that didn't seem to exist, and travel reimbursements for trips that never happened. Each fraudulent transaction was small enough to fly under the radar, a death by 1,000 cuts. In the digital records, these expenses were masterfully disguised, absorbed into the massive overhead of the operations department. The consulting fees were recoded as logistics software upgrades. The non-existent trips became supply chain site visits. From the outside, it looked like my department was a bloated, inefficient money pit, while sales appeared lean and effective. Mark hadn't just been stealing, he had been systematically framing me for years, using my own department's budget as a smokescreen for his embezzlement. The scale of the theft was staggering. I spent hours with a calculator, my hand shaking as I tallied the numbers. It was close to $2 million. $2 million siphoned out of the company over 5 years, a slow, steady poison that had created the very financial crisis they had blamed on me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't my mismanagement that had crippled the company, it was my brother's greed. He had engineered the entire crisis, creating the perfect justification to get rid of me and seize control. The private equity deal was likely his endgame, a way to cash out and cover his tracks before the whole rotten structure collapsed. But I needed more than just old ledgers and a handful of digital files. I needed concrete proof, something that couldn't be dismissed as the bitter rantings of a disgruntled ex-employee. I needed to connect the shell companies and the fake invoices directly to Mark. This meant I needed access to the company's current servers, to the payment records and email communications that would prove his guilt beyond any doubt. And for that, I needed help. My mind immediately went to one person, Jessica. Jessica had been the senior accountant at Vanguard for over 30 years. She was a fixture, a quiet, unassuming woman who knew the company's financial nervous system better than anyone. She had been hired by my grandfather and was fiercely loyal to my father's memory. She had always been kind to me, appreciating my detail-oriented approach, a trait I shared with my father. Mark, on the other hand, had always treated her with a dismissive condescension, viewing her as a relic of a bygone era. I hoped that her loyalty to my father's legacy and her disdain for Mark's arrogance would outweigh her fear of losing her job. Getting in touch with her was risky. I couldn't call her or email her work address. Mark would undoubtedly be monitoring communications. I found her home address in an old company directory I had saved and decided to approach her directly. That evening, I drove to her small, tidy house in a quiet neighborhood on the other side of town. As I walked up to her front door, my heart pounded in my chest. Everything depended on this conversation. If she turned me away, my investigation would hit a dead end. I rang the doorbell and a few moments later the door opened a crack. Jessica peered out, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw me. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" she whispered, glancing nervously up and down the street. "Jessica, I need to talk to you," I said, my voice low. "It's important. It's about the company. It's about my father." The mention of my father seemed to strike a chord. She hesitated for a moment, then opened the door wider. "Come in, quickly." I stepped inside and she led me to her small living room. She was clearly on edge, wringing her hands as she sat on the edge of her armchair. "You shouldn't be here, Daniel," she said. "If Mark finds out, T." "That's why I came," I interrupted gently. "Because I think you know that something is wrong. You've been there for 30 years, Jessica. You've seen it all. You can't tell me you believe the story they spun about me." She looked down at her hands, avoiding my gaze. "It didn't feel right," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "The numbers, they didn't add up to the story Mark was telling. The operational overruns seemed manufactured, but I couldn't prove anything. And Alina, she believes everything he says." What? That was all the confirmation I needed. I opened my briefcase and laid out copies of my father's ledgers next to the falsified digital reports. I walked her through it page by page, showing her the discrepancies, the recoded expenses, the pattern of deceit that stretched back 5 years. As she followed the trail of numbers, her expression shifted from fear to a quiet, simmering anger. "I knew it," she whispered, her finger tracing a particularly blatant falsified invoice. "I knew there was something rotten. This consulting firm, Strategic Solutions, they've been paid over $100,000 in the last year. I could never find a record of their contract or any proof of work being delivered. Mark told me it was a special project approved directly by your father before he passed. It was a lie." "I know," I said, "and I believe Mark is the one behind it all. He's been bleeding the company dry and pinning the blame on me, but I need to prove it. I need access to the payment authorization records and the server logs. I need to see who set up these shell companies and where the money is really going." Jessica looked at me, her eyes filled with a conflict of emotions. She was a woman who had spent her life following the rules, a loyal soldier in a company she loved. I was asking her to risk everything, her job, her reputation, her pension. "If I help you," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "and we get caught, I'll lose everything. I'm 3 years from retirement." "I know what I'm asking," I replied, my gaze steady. "But this isn't just about me, Jessica. It's about my father's legacy. Mark is destroying everything he and your grandfather built. He's turned our family business into his personal slush fund. We are the only ones who can stop him." I let the words hang in the air, the silence stretching between us. I could see the internal struggle on her face. Then she took a deep breath and a look of steely resolve settled in her eyes, the same look I had seen on my own face in the mirror a few days before. "Your father was a good man," she said, her voice now firm. "He wouldn't have stood for this. No one is in the office late on a Friday. The servers are most vulnerable then. Be at the back entrance at 10 p.m. on Friday. I'll get you in. You'll have 2 hours." The following Friday night felt like a scene out of a spy movie. I was parked a block away from the Vanguard Logistics headquarters, the building a dark silhouette against the city skyline. My stomach was a knot of anxiety. I was about to break into my own family's company, a place I had once considered a second home. At exactly 10 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, "Coast is clear, back entrance." I pulled on a baseball cap, grabbed my laptop bag, and made my way to the rear of the building, sticking to the shadows. The alley was deserted. The metal door, usually locked and bolted, was slightly ajar. I slipped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The building was eerily silent, the familiar daytime hustle replaced by the low hum of servers and ventilation systems. Jessica was waiting for me in the hallway, her face pale in the dim emergency lighting. She didn't say a word, simply gesturing for me to follow her. She led me to the accounting department, a sea of darkened cubicles. Her office was in the corner, and she quickly unlocked it, ushering me inside. "I've disabled the security camera loop for this hallway for the next 2 hours," she whispered, her voice tense. "And I've logged into the main server using a dormant administrator account that hasn't been purged from the system. It should give you unrestricted access. But you have to be fast, Daniel. Every minute we're in here is a risk." I nodded, my hands already flying across my laptop keyboard. I connected to the server, and a wave of relief washed over me as the system granted me access. I had a clear plan, a checklist of everything I needed to find. First, the shell companies. I started with Strategic Solutions, the name Jessica had mentioned. A quick search of the payment database brought up a series of wire transfers, all authorized by Mark. The payments were sent to a bank account registered to a corporation. I ran the corporation's name through a public records database and found what I was looking for. The sole registered agent was a man named David Chen. The name didn't ring a bell, but the registered address for the corporation did. It was a small, unassuming house in a suburb not far from where Mark lived. A quick social media search for David Chen in the area brought up a profile. His pictures were filled with familiar faces, friends of my brother. The connection was tenuous, but it was a start. Next, I dove into Mark's company emails. I had to be careful, searching for keywords that wouldn't raise any flags. I searched for invoice numbers, bank account details, and the names of the shell companies. It was like fishing in a vast, dark ocean, but then I got a hit. It was an email from Mark to his personal email address sent over a year ago. The subject line was tax docs. Attached was a scanned copy of a passport. The name on the passport was David Chen. My breath caught in my throat. Mark had a copy of this man's passport on his computer. This was more than a friendship, this was a conspiracy. David Chen was likely a pawn, a friend whose name Mark was using to create a believable front for his fraudulent activities. The real breakthrough came when I started analyzing the server's access logs. I wanted to see who had altered the financial records, who had recoded the expenses from sales to operations. The logs showed a series of after-hours logins over the past few years, all from the same IP address. It wasn't Mark's office computer. It was a remote IP address, one that was routed through a series of proxy servers to mask its origin. Mark was smart, but he wasn't a technical genius. He had hidden his tracks, but not perfectly. I ran a trace on the IP address, a process that took precious minutes, my eyes glued to the progress bar on my screen. Jessica stood by the door, a nervous sentry, her eyes darting towards the hallway. "How much longer, Daniel?" she whispered. "Almost there," I muttered, my focus absolute. Finally, the trace completed. The IP address originated from a residential internet service provider registered to an address. My blood ran cold as I read it. It was the address of Mark's home. He had been logging in from his house in the middle of the night, methodically altering the company's financial records to cover his theft and frame me. It was the digital smoking gun. I worked frantically, downloading everything I could: the wire transfer records, the emails, the server logs, the IP trace results. I copied it all onto a secure, encrypted hard drive, my hands moving with a desperate urgency. "We need to go," Jessica said, her voice sharp with panic. "I think I heard a security patrol downstairs." I quickly and safely ejected the drive, shut down my laptop, and packed my bag. We slipped out of her office, our footsteps echoing in the silent building. Jessica reset the security camera loop from a terminal near the exit. We made our way back to the rear entrance, every shadow seeming to hold a threat. As I stepped back out into the cool night air, I felt a profound sense of both terror and triumph. We had done it. We had the proof. The digital trail was clear and undeniable. It led directly to my brother. As I drove home, the encrypted hard drive on the passenger seat felt like the heaviest thing I had ever held. It contained the truth, a truth that would either set me free or tear my family apart for good. But there was no turning back now. The whispers from the past had become a digital scream, and I was ready to make sure everyone heard it. The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline and coffee. With the encrypted hard drive in my possession, I felt a surge of power I hadn't experienced in months. The victim narrative that had been suffocating me was gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of a man armed with the truth. But I knew that simply possessing the evidence wasn't enough. Mark was charismatic and manipulative, and my mother was willfully blind to his faults. If I just walked into the boardroom and threw a folder of documents on the table, they would spin it, discredit me, and paint me as a desperate, vindictive liar. I couldn't fight this battle alone. I needed to build an alliance to create a situation where the truth was not only revealed but irrefutable. My first call was to Sarah, my ex-wife. Our separation had been painful, born out of the stress I had brought home from work every night, but underneath the hurt there had always been a foundation of respect. Sarah was a corporate lawyer, sharp, pragmatic, and utterly incorruptible. She knew the ins and outs of corporate malfeasance better than anyone. When I called her, she was hesitant at first, her voice guarded. "Daniel, is everything okay?" "Not really," I said, my voice steady. "But I think I'm about to make it okay. I need your help, Sarah, not as my ex-wife, but as a lawyer. I have something you need to see." We met at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop halfway between our homes. I laid out the story for her, from the boardroom coup to the late-night mission with Jessica. I showed her the data on my laptop, the falsify. Ed invoices, the server logs, the IP trace that led directly to Mark's house. As she reviewed the evidence, her expression shifted from cautious skepticism to professional outrage. "He didn't just embezzle Daniel," she said, her legal mind immediately dissecting the situation. "This is wire fraud, aggravated identity theft using that David Chen fellow's passport, and securities fraud if he misrepresented the company's financial health to the new investors. He could go to prison for a very long time." Hearing her say it aloud made it real. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore, it was a serious criminal matter. "What do I do?" I asked. "I can't just go to the police. My mother, it would destroy her, and the company. A public scandal like this would ruin Vanguard." Sarah leaned back, tapping her pen against her notepad. "You have two goals here," she said, her voice all business. "First, you need to clear your name and be made whole financially. Second, you need to remove Mark from the company to protect its future. A public trial is messy. A private confrontation, however, can be very effective provided you control the narrative." Her plan was simple and brilliant. We wouldn't go to the board and we wouldn't go to the police. Not yet. We would go to the new majority stakeholders, the private equity firm. Their name was Northgate Holdings. They had invested millions of dollars based on a lie, on fraudulent financial statements that Mark had manufactured. They had a vested interest in a quiet, clean resolution that protected their investment from a public scandal. Sarah drafted a formal letter to the CEO of Northgate, a man named Marcus Thorne. The letter was a masterpiece of legal precision. It laid out the situation in stark, unambiguous terms, referencing the evidence we had without revealing all of it. It made it clear that we were offering them an opportunity to handle the situation internally, to avoid a catastrophic public implosion that would tank their new assets' stock value and reputation. It concluded by requesting an urgent, confidential meeting. While Sarah handled the corporate angle, I focused on the personal one. I needed to be sure of my mother's reaction. I still held a sliver of hope that she would see the truth, that her maternal instincts would override her blind faith in Mark. I called her and asked to meet, telling her it was a matter of life and death regarding the family. She agreed, her voice laced with weary reluctance. We met at her house, the grand, imposing home I had grown up in. The air was thick with unspoken resentments. I didn't lead with the accusations. I started with my father's ledgers. I showed her his familiar handwriting, reminding her of the man he was: meticulous, honest, and fiercely protective of the company he had built. "Dad taught us that the numbers don't lie, Mom," I said, my voice soft. "And I've spent the last month reading the story they tell." I then walked her through it, not with the cold, hard data of wire fraud, but with the narrative of betrayal. I showed her how the small, consistent thefts began right after Dad died, how the company's profits were artificially deflated while Mark's personal wealth grew. I didn't show her the server logs or the IP traces, just the simple, undeniable math in her late husband's own ledgers. As I spoke, I watched her face. The initial defensiveness began to crack. A flicker of doubt, then confusion, and finally a dawning horror appeared in her eyes. The idea that I, her diligent if unexciting older son, could be a failure was believable to her. But the idea that Mark, her charming golden boy, could be a thief, a common criminal, it was a possibility she had never allowed herself to consider. "It can't be," she whispered, shaking her head, but her voice lacked conviction. "Mark loves this family, he loves this company. He loves money, Mom," I said gently, "and he was willing to sacrifice me and Dad's entire legacy to get it." I left her with that thought, a seed of doubt planted in the foundation of her belief system. I didn't need her to be my ally yet. I just needed her to be willing to listen when the time came. The call from Northgate Holdings came 2 days later. Marcus Thorne himself wanted a meeting. He sounded calm on the phone, but I could hear the undercurrent of urgency. We were to meet at his downtown office the next morning. Sarah, Jessica, and I would be there. The alliance was forged. We had the legal firepower, the first-hand financial testimony, and the undeniable digital proof. We were ready. The stage was set for a confrontation, not in the family boardroom where emotions and history held sway, but in the sterile, neutral territory of high finance, where numbers were the only thing that mattered. The offices of Northgate Holdings were the epitome of corporate power, all glass, steel, and muted tones of gray. The air itself felt expensive. I stood alongside Sarah and Jessica in the elevator ascending to the 40th floor. My suit felt tight, my palms were sweating, but my mind was clear. Sarah was a picture of calm professionalism, her presence a reassuring anchor. Jessica, though visibly nervous, held her head high, her loyalty to my father's memory giving her a quiet strength. We were ushered into a large, intimidating boardroom. Marcus Thorne was already there, flanked by two of his top legal advisors. He was a man in his late 50s with sharp eyes and an air of someone who did not suffer fools gladly. He didn't offer to shake hands, simply gesturing for us to sit. "I've read your letter, Mr. Evans," Thorne began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "It makes some very serious allegations. Before we proceed, I want to be crystal clear. If you are wasting my time or if this is some kind of ploy to extort a better severance package, I will not hesitate to use the full force of my legal team to ruin you." Sarah responded before I could, her voice cool and unfazed. "Mr. Thorne, we are not here to waste your time. We are here to protect your investment. My client has uncovered a systematic, multi-year fraud perpetrated by the current CFO of Vanguard Logistics, Mark Evans. We have irrefutable evidence that he has embezzled close to $2 million and deliberately falsified financial records to conceal his crimes, records upon which your firm based its acquisition." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Evidence?" I took that as my cue. I connected my laptop to the large screen at the end of the table. For the next hour, I presented the case we had built. I started with my father's ledgers, showing the baseline of the company's true financial health. Then I overlaid the digital records, highlighting the discrepancies, the recoded expenses, the shell companies. Jessica provided commentary, confirming the irregularities from an accounting perspective and explaining how the digital books had been cooked. Finally, I displayed the smoking gun, the wire transfers authorized by Mark, the email with the scanned passport, and the server logs showing the alterations being made, late at night, from his home IP address. By the time I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Thorne and his lawyers were staring at the screen, their faces grim. One of the lawyers leaned over and whispered something to Thorne. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on me. "You've been thorough," he said, the earlier hostility in his voice replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He understood the implications immediately. A public scandal would not only be a financial disaster for Northgate, but a colossal embarrassment. He had been duped. "What do you want?" Thorne asked, his tone making it clear he was now negotiating. "First, I want my name cleared," I said firmly. "I want a public statement issued exonerating me of any and all responsibility for the company's recent financial difficulties. Second, I want to be reinstated not as operations manager but as CEO. I know this company better than anyone, and I am the only one who can clean up the mess Mark has made." I paused, then added, "And third, I want my brother gone. I don't want him prosecuted. I want him stripped of his shares, his title, and his position, and I want him to sign a non-disclosure agreement so airtight he can't even whisper the name Vanguard for the rest of his life. The money he stole, he can pay it back to the company over time. My family has been through enough." It was a bold play, but I knew Thorne's priority would be damage control, not justice. A quiet removal was infinitely preferable to a public trial. Thorne considered my terms for a long moment. "And your mother, Eleanor Evans, she's still on the board." "My mother will be at a meeting I am calling for this afternoon," I said. "She will do the right thing." The meeting was set for 3 p.m. at the Vanguard headquarters in the same boardroom where I had been cast out weeks before. Thorne's lawyers handled the logistics, summoning Mark and my mother under the pretext of an urgent meeting with Northgate. When I walked into the room, the shock on my brother's face was deeply satisfying. He paled when he saw me, then his eyes darted to our mother, who was already seated, her face a stone mask. Thorne and his lawyers were also present, their expressions like thunderclouds. "What is he doing here?" Mark demanded, his voice a mixture of arrogance and confusion. "Daniel is here," Thorne said coldly, "because he is the one who saved our collective skins from the mess you created." And with that, the confrontation began. It was not the shouting match I had imagined. It was a cold, clinical execution. Thorne's lawyers laid out the evidence, the same presentation I had given them that morning. Mark tried to deny it, to bluster and lie his way out of it, but the digital evidence was overwhelming. He called me a liar, a thief who had planted the evidence to save himself. But when they displayed the logs, the ones that traced back to his home IP address, the fight went out of him. He sank into his chair, his face ashen, a cornered animal with nowhere left to run. The final blow came from our mother. Her face was etched with a pain so deep it seemed to have aged her 10 years in a few hours. She looked at Mark, her voice a broken whisper. "I saw the ledgers, Mark, your father's ledgers, how could you?" In that moment, the blind faith she had placed in her younger son finally shattered, leaving behind the devastating wreckage of his betrayal. She voted with the Northgate representatives. It was unanimous. Mark was stripped of his titles, his shares were forfeited as partial repayment of the stolen funds, and he was forced to sign a sheaf of legal documents that effectively erased him from the company and the industry. He didn't look at me as he was escorted from the room by Thorne's security. He just looked small, a pathetic shell of the charismatic man he had pretended to be. The golden boy had fallen and the scapegoat was now in charge. The aftermath of the boardroom confrontation was quiet and swift. Northgate Holdings, true to their word, handled the transition with ruthless efficiency. The official story, released to the public and the employees, was that Mark Evans had resigned for personal reasons, and that the board had unanimously voted to appoint me, Daniel Evans, as the new CEO to guide Vanguard Logistics into a new era of stability and growth. A separate internal memo was circulated, vaguely alluding to managerial improprieties that had been discovered and rectified, fully exonerating me from any blame for the company's recent struggles. It was a corporate whitewashing, but it served its purpose. My name was cleared. My first few weeks as CEO were a whirlwind. The company was in a more precarious state than I had even realized. Mark's fraudulent accounting had hidden deep structural problems. Morale was low, and there was a palpable sense of confusion and mistrust among the staff. I didn't hide from it. I held a company-wide town hall meeting. I stood before the men and women I had worked alongside for 15 years, and I told them the truth, not the sordid details of my brother's betrayal, but the truth about the challenges we faced and the hard work it would take to overcome them. I laid out my vision for the future, a vision built on the principles my father had instilled in me: honesty, transparency, and a relentless commitment to excellence. Jessica was my first official appointment. I promoted her to Chief Financial Officer. Her quiet integrity and deep knowledge of the company were exactly what we needed to restore financial order. Together, we worked day and night, untangling the web of deceit Mark had woven. We renegotiated contracts, streamlined bloated budgets, and invested in the operational infrastructure he had allowed to decay. It was grueling work, but with every small victory, with every balanced budget and positive client feedback, I felt a piece of my own fractured identity healing. I was no longer just the scapegoat or the forgotten son. I was a leader, rebuilding my father's legacy from the ashes of my brother's greed. My relationship with my mother was the most difficult part to navigate. She was a ghost of her former self, a woman broken by the revelation of her favorite son's true nature. We had one long, painful conversation a week after Mark was forced out. She sat in her cavernous living room, the silence between us heavy with years of unspoken words. "I am so sorry, Daniel," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I was blind. I wanted to believe the best of him, and in doing so, I believed the worst of you. I failed you as a mother. I wanted to be angry, to rage at her for the years of favoritism, for the casual cruelty of her disbelief in me, but looking at her shattered form, all I felt was a profound, aching sadness. "We all made mistakes," I said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "Now we have to decide what to do next." She chose to retire from the board, officially stepping away from the company for good. It was the right decision. Her presence would have been a constant, painful reminder of the schism that had torn our family apart. We began the slow, awkward process of rebuilding our relationship, not as business partners, but simply as mother and son. The wounds were deep, and I knew they might never fully heal, but for the first time we were talking, truly talking, without the shadow of the company falling between us. I never saw Mark again. As part of his severance agreement, he was required to leave the state. I heard through the grapevine that he was living somewhere on the West Coast, working a low-level sales job under a different name. He was paying back the money he stole, a small amount garnished from his wages each month, a constant reminder of his downfall. I never felt the need for revenge beyond that. See. Him stripped of the power and prestige he craved was justice enough. His exile was his prison. 6 months after I took over as CEO, I stood in my father's old office, now my own, looking out at the bustling logistics yard below. The company was stabilizing. We had even won back the Sterling account, our former biggest client. I had met with their CEO personally, explained the situation without melodrama, and guaranteed them a level of service and transparency they would not find anywhere else. He had been impressed by my candor and had decided to give us a second chance. The trucks bearing the Vanguard logo moved with a renewed sense of purpose, a reflection of the changes I was working to implement. I was building something new, a legacy that honored my father's principles but was not defined by his shadow. It was my own. The ledgers, my father's gift from the past, still sat on my bookshelf, a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the light. The silence in my house was no longer oppressive, it was peaceful. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and had not only survived, but emerged stronger, more certain of who I was and what I was capable of. I had lost a brother, but I had found myself.